Okay, there will be some familiar faces on the panel, including Daniel, who was just on stage just a few minutes ago. But I'm just going to run through this now. Okay, right, we'll make a start. So this is going to be a panel discussion. There will be Q&A at the end of this as well, and then we'll be having the lunch break immediately afterwards. So please do get involved. Please do ask some questions. We've got a great panel here, got a great topic of conversation. It's really important that we get your feedback and insights and questions as well. So please do try and take part. We do have a microphone that we can bring around as well. If you have any questions, just put your hand in the air and we'll come round to you. Okay, so this panel is entitled Data-Driven Decision Making. And as we know, data is the new gold. It has the potential to help you make better decisions using facts, metrics, and statistics to implement strategies that keep your business performing at its best. Except not everyone knows how to get the best out of the data that they're collecting, and that's definitely one of the things we're going to be talking about today. So if you're struggling with making the most of your data, join our panel of experts as they discuss the tools and tips you can use to supercharge your business using all the data already available at your fingertips. So joining me are Jennifer Bisceglie, founder and CEO of Interos. Jennifer is the founder and CEO, as I said, the dynamic supply chain risk management and operational resilience company. Under Jennifer's leadership, Interos has emerged as a major player in the operational resilience space, empowering clients such as the US Department of Defense, NASA, and a host of Fortune 500 companies with the tools and counsel needed to detect and respond to crises before they happen. Also joining us are Daniel Helmig, who you may have just seen on this stage in the previous session. Daniel is the Managing Director and Head of Procurement at Credit Suisse and has more than 35 years of experience. Next to Daniel is Yali Sassoon. He is co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer at SnowPlow. Yali is a self-confessed data guy, which is really handy considering we're talking about data. He studied natural sciences and then the history and philosophy of science at university, which gave him a broad appreciation of how data has been used to drive different styles of reasoning and progress across a wide range of scientific disciplines. And making up our panel is Nick Riley. He is head of buying at Vertice. Nick and his team help companies achieve fairer outcomes when buying SaaS. Nick has seen firsthand how pricing disparity can affect businesses that have no access to data and advocates for SaaS companies to be more open with how they price their tools. So please welcome your panel. Okay, I'm going to turn to Yali first, actually, as our self-confessed data guy. So just give us an overview, if you like, of what we mean by data-driven decision-making.
So data has the potential to support decision-making in a number of different ways. If we take it right back to 50,000 feet, data tells us facts about the world, so we can use it to describe the world. We can use it to understand the world and connections. We can use it to make predictions about the world. And predictions about, how we can intervene in that world to drive outcomes that we want to accomplish as a business. And critically, we can use data to measure the impact of the decisions and the intervention. So data has really broad applicability in business. Companies have been using data since, the 60s and 70s, if you think about lean manufacturing and what the guys at Toyota were doing. And it's been really interesting over the last few decades, seeing data being used in more and more sophisticated ways, all the way from that to the way we see now artificial intelligence embedded in, all our day-to-day devices, the kind of things that Google and Uber and Amazon have popularized.
Mm-hmm. And Jen, what does data-driven decision-making mean from an Interos point of view?
Well, I couldn't agree more with what Yali was just sharing. And, so we focus on the global supply chain. And if you think about the fact that it is global, there is no way that any one person that has a line of sight on whether it's diversity within the supply chain or cost effectiveness of the supply chain, you have no idea really what the impact is. So whether it's inflation or cyber breaches or just geopolitical unrest, all of that's coming at you. And I heard a quote a few years ago by Michael Dell that said, we've actually only harnessed the power of about 11% of the world's data. And so from an Interos standpoint, this is where AI and computers actually help us, right? So if I can get clean data, which I know is something we're going to talk about as well, if I can get clean data that I can make sense of, how do I use that at a moment's notice to do a lot of the things that Daniel talked about on his last session, right? Like, how do I make better business decisions based on just the fact that we're a global economy and we're hyper-connected? And I think that really played out in the last 3 years.
Absolutely, and you mentioned Daniel's session just then, and talking about the value of data-driven decisions. So, Dan, from your perspective, why is data considered the new gold?
I mean, if you look at what has happened over the last 10, 20 years, in the past it was very difficult to actually get a lot of data together because it was very expensive. You had an issue that data storage cost, data calculation cost, it was very difficult, computing power was very difficult, so therefore you were very careful in terms of selecting what kind of data you get. Today, this is no longer an issue. You can basically have vast amount of data, and then it is no longer that you just look at little cubby holes and open it up and put something into SAP and then later on take it out. You can have all the data of a supply chain and then really do gold digging, which is you basically sift through all the mud and then get to something which is actually meaningful for your business, which before you could never basically figure out because you did not have the transparency that you have today.
Well, that's a really interesting point, and I'm going to put Nick on the spot here with this one. So Daniel talked about prospecting for gold there when it comes to looking at your data, but how do you know what gold looks like?
It's really tough, right? Because we have all of this data that historically has been incredibly siloed. And so now it's about bringing the data together to understand what the data is actually telling you, which almost sounds oxymoronic, but it's not. You need to be looking at your data from multiple angles to make sure that all of the decisions that you're making around your data are supported by the rest of the data. Because what I've seen happen is you give a subset of your company the ability to look at data and draw conclusions from it, but actually it goes totally against something else that's happening in another part of the business. So you've got to make sure that you're not looking at data in silos and that you're actually looking at it much more broadly.
Can I just add something to that? Because I think it's a really important point. Data is only as good as the questions that you ask of it. And where data is siloed for just a particular part of an organization, you've only got a small number of people that are asking questions. Opening that up so that there are more creative people coming to the data. Data is this amazing property where data that can be collected or created for one purpose, if somebody else comes and asks it a new question, can unlock a whole set of new answers. But you always need the person there asking the right question, and that's often the part in the value chain that gets neglected.
I think so. One of the other things that I've seen people struggle with is giving people access to data without them understanding what they want to try and derive from it. So what happens is you end up with confirmation bias, and you see all this data and you say, well, actually that's telling me exactly what I was expecting it to tell me, rather than looking at it from or you end up looking at it subjectively. And again, it stops it being so useful if you're coming up with your conclusion and then making the data match the conclusion rather than taking a broader look at the data and then seeing what it tells you.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jennifer, I saw you nodding in agreement earlier as well. So how can businesses implement data-driven functions for greater success? Where do they start?
Well, I was actually nodding because I think what we talk about is always starting with what's the problem I'm trying to solve for? Right, so it's not looking at the data to confirm what that I'm going to create a business problem around the data that I see, but literally the first thing to do is not to get overwhelmed, right? And so making sure they have the mechanics in place to view the data in a way that it's useful for me, whether I'm sifting through gold or I'm just responsible to solve X problem. And so this is just making you more informed and better informed, and hopefully at speed and at scale. But it's really not necessarily trying to, revamp everything that you're doing. It's really just bringing the information closer to you that says, okay, well, this is the problem I'm responsible for, yeah? And then here's the data in front of me. And I think the first thing is really just understanding what is the business problem I'm trying to solve, because that's what all this is. This is just to make us smarter, faster. It's not necessarily, trying to revolutionize what we're doing. Although I think if you use data smartly, you do have the opportunity to make the world a better place.
Yeah, this is something I hear often. I'll come to you, Yali, actually. this is something I hear a lot from executives saying that quite often an organization doesn't necessarily know the problem that it's trying to solve. What's your experience of that?
So there always has to be a person, a team that's identified a problem. You hear stories about people who look at the data and suddenly a problem or challenge presents itself, but in reality, I've never seen that happen. And I don't really believe the stories. It's always somebody coming with a hypothesis and using the data to test or validate that hypothesis, and doing it honestly, not just looking for the right slice of data that's going to confirm it. So, yeah, I think that pragmatism. Let's take the data and let's start with our biggest problems and see, how the data can help us solve our biggest problems. And then the second dimension, when being pragmatic, is start using the data in simple ways first to understand the problem and come up with some simple hypotheses, and then work towards more and more sophisticated approaches. I see a lot of organizations trying to jump to artificial intelligence and machine learning. All of that can come, but you've got to walk before you can run.
And do you see value in the team that come up with the problem, not necessarily being the team that are looking at the data because of that confirmation bias?
Absolutely, partly because of the confirmation bias, but partly because of just the difference in opinion. It's, when you're in the weeds, it's hard to see the wood for the trees. So I think that's a big driver behind the whole data democratization movement, is just getting people to be able to ask questions of parts of the business that they're not necessarily, and obviously there are all kinds of political issues with that. But in the right culture, that can be incredibly helpful, incredibly powerful.
And Daniel, I'm going to come to you now as well. Obviously, based on your years, if not decades of experience, I think I can say that. In a post-ERP world, how do you get the data you need to run a supply chain, and how do you draw conclusions?
If you look at today, in the past we used eventually Oracle or SAP, and everything was used through this. The whole operation was set in these systems, and it was painful often. It can be as well great, but normally it's painful. So today you have a lot of different systems, and when you look at the Gartner report, you can see basically all the different opportunities to collect the best system that can do one specific thing best. So therefore you have then 3, 4, 5 different systems that you use to run procurement, supply chain. Underneath needs to be a data lake. You need to be able to collect all this data into a data lake, and then all of you, for example, here that are in procurement, you should understand to some extent as well what Kafka means. Yeah? What different kind of systems mean. And Kafka is not in this case, not the German author. It is basically a software that are being used in the intro space of a big data lake. If you understand most of this, and you understand as well how to process that, you then can utilize this. If you do it right and you get the data together, you can solve issues such as, why is my transformer always 2 months late? Why do we not get the optimum amount of inventory in Saudi Arabia when we need it? Why do I have an issue in the Amazonas, for example, for shipping something? Because you have all the data together that you can connect. So it's not data, it's data leading to information, leading to insights. So if I go to executives, I would never talk about, hey, I have data. No one cares. But when you can say, what is your biggest issue? You always say that, what is the issue that we're trying to solve? Then you can say, look, and I have the system, I have the environment available in which I can provide you the insights, not the data, not the information.
Okay, now I am going to be coming to the audience later for questions, but are there any at this stage that you would like to ask the panel that might drive the conversation in a slightly different direction? Okay, hold that thought then. Okay, so Nick, some keywords that we hear a lot are transparency, agility, efficiency, and resilience at the moment, especially resilience. How can a data-driven approach help with that?
I think when you take data and when you look at data and you're consistent with the way that you look at data, it allows you to make informed, good decisions quickly, which is the plus side, but I think it's a double-edged sword. And if you allow too many people to extrapolate too much from the data, you actually end up with people measuring different metrics. No one can agree on what exactly is important to the business. So yes, it can make you incredibly agile, and I think everyone here would agree with that, but it really is a case of make sure that those metrics are very relevant and stay up to date. Make sure that the people in the business understand why those metrics are key, that they understand what the outcome those metrics are trying to drive is, and ultimately why it's important for them. I think I'm a big believer of what's in it for me. If you can't articulate to your team why these things are important, what happens is they go off and they draw their own conclusions from the same data, and then you end up arguing about whose data is the best data. So I don't know if I've answered your question very well, but it does allow you to be all of those things that you said, but it really is about somebody very senior owning those metrics and making sure that everyone understands that they are the metrics, that it's not data for everyone as much as it is democratized. This is the data that the business, and this is the KPIs that the business cares about, and this is the outcome that we're trying to drive by looking at them.
Can I add just one thing? So I think for me, to bring it back to basics, most of us, not all of us, but most of us are not in the business to be in data, right? And I think that's your point. So as CEO of a company, I want to be profitable. Don't hold it against me, but I want to be profitable. And so how do I leverage data, right, to make me profitable? That's really the problem we're solving. And so when you think about resilience, right, so in our world, all I care about is supply chain all day, every day. I want to have alternatives, right? That allows me to be resilient. So when Florida, right, the hurricane, $63 billion, right, that's massive. It affects over 600,000 companies across just the first couple tiers of the global supply, and that's just one microcosm. And the ripple effect of that, it's taking out whole masses of the food supply chain, because that's where a lot of that agriculture comes from. So the knock-on effect from there. How do I leverage the insights? Yeah, and I think that goes back, Nick, to your question a little while ago. Yali, is that at our level, we don't care about data, right? We care about the insights. I need to be profitable. I need to be resilient. I need to get food product back on the shelves so people can be fed, right? Those are the things that I'm accessing insights that the data informs. So to your point, it's a different set of skill set and a different set of people that will get there, that says, okay, well, Jennifer and her company, craft food, whatever, we need to make them resilient. We need to solve the business problem. Go figure out what the data is going to tell me, and it's going to tell me weather patterns, right? It's going to tell me, physical logistics. How am I going to get the product to the right place at the right time? Where are the consumers? But I think when you think about data-driven decisions and resilience, that's what it is. But I think all four of us have agreed that you have to have the business problem in mind, because if not, then you're just collecting data for data's sake, and that really doesn't solve a problem. The other thing, I think, Yali, to your point, we actually did a session solely focused on human augmented AI, because there's so much discussion around data and artificial intelligence right now. And to your point, outside of a movie like Minority Report, like these things don't happen automatically yet. And I think that I just couldn't agree from a level setting standpoint. You're asking really great questions, but all of this needs to drive better informed decision making, and that is resilient, right? That's the global economy for you.
Absolutely. And as you said, it's all well and good having this data, but if businesses don't have the skills or knowledge to interpret that data or to use that data, then it's essentially pointless, I would argue. Yali, actually, so what steps do you think businesses can take to get the most out of the data once they've collected it?
So I challenge the idea that there's this collecting phase that happens. This, you pull the data from all the different systems, you get it in one place, and then you come to it with questions, you deliver the insight, and you make your decision, and you go off and are happy. I think it's much more of a learning loop. So there's a problem that you have. You get the data to help inform and solve that problem. Sometimes that data will be in the business. Sometimes you'll need to create it, because it might not exist in the business. You start to use it to answer the question. You learn something that changes the way you see things. Maybe you come up with a new hypothesis, and then you go back to the data And again, you might need to go and collect or create some more data. And until you're actually using the data to solve a problem, you don't know that the data's good enough, that it's accurate, that it's complete, that it's going to give you what you need to solve that problem. And so there's this learning loop that businesses need to go on. And the biggest piece of advice I'd give is that if you're trying to use data in a new part of the business to solve a new problem, you really need to get a cross-functional team in place to do that. A team that have the people with the domain expertise that understand the problem and can come up with the hypotheses, the data analysts or the data scientists that can use data to answer the questions, and the data engineers that can prepare and collect the data, that know about Kafka and data lakes, or that can go out and create the data. And more we're seeing even data product managers, people coming into businesses to help them create new data sets. A nice example to your resilience point, I was talking to an insurance company that were using AI to create data that estimated where the perimeter of a property is based on the address and satellite imagery. And that's really important if you want to understand your exposure to flood risk. That was data that business needed that it didn't have. So getting all those people sat together trying to use the data to solve the problem maximizes your chance to get through that iteration loop as fast as possible and get to business impact as fast as possible. And I get very nervous when I hear there's some project to go and collect a lot of data in a data lake and then socialize it and hope that lots of great things are going to come of it, because oftentimes that doesn't work, or you get people coming to it and using the data in ways that might not be quite right.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think we've all got experience of that happening for sure. So, Nick, what's your take on that as well? When it comes around to businesses not having the skills or knowledge to interpret that data, how can they get the most out of it?
I think when it comes to the data that you've got, you want it to be one of two things, right? You want it to give you insight, or you want it to be actionable. And so if it's not either comparing A to B, or you versus a previous version of you that's giving you that level of insight, or it's not telling you something, for example, we know if we don't touch a customer for 30 days, there's an increased risk of them churning, so we want an alert every time we've not touched a customer for 30 days. If it's not giving us that level of action, really, I think you have to ask yourself, what are we doing with the data? So you need to be pretty honest with yourself in ascertaining, is one of those two things happening? But then you also need to understand, is it objective or subjective data as well? That's really important. And I guess as a working example, what Vertice do is we help people buy SaaS. Now, the objective part of that is benchmarking of scoring, of pricing, right? So that's fairly objective. But we go into every negotiation with the subjective view of, well, who's the sales rep? How long have they been there? Because actually the subjective view that you're taking informs the objective data that you're going to get, and allows you to apply the objective data in a far more nuanced way when you understand the subjective side of it. So it's about understanding all four of those points, I think, with all of the data that you collect. So is it giving you insight or actionable, or is it comparative, and is it objective and subjective? So it's about bringing that skill set in, who can draw conclusions from the data, and then allowing people to go to market with it, or whatever their function is going to do with the data.
Okay, Jennifer, one of the challenges of data-driven decision-making, it's often said, is a lack of tools and infrastructure. So how can we actually overcome this?
My answer was go buy a tool or infrastructure. But and again, we all have kind of probably different perspectives based on where we sit, but I spend a lot of time talking to CEOs of major organizations. And again, our small world begins and ends in supply chain. And normally, almost 3/4, we just did a survey on this actually, about 3/4 of the folks we're talking to right now are all buying technology in effort to leverage data. Because unless you're made up of a bunch of data scientists, and we have several organizations that we work with that do have massive data scientists, teams that still have tools to access it. But I really focus from a C-suite standpoint, it has to provide an insight. It has to answer a business problem. And if I don't understand the business problem I'm trying to solve for, and I don't understand some sort of idea about what the answer needs to be. It doesn't need to give me the answer, but Again, is it going to make me profitable? Is it going to do a China plus one, right? Like, what's the business problem I'm trying to solve for? Once I do that, then I can invest in tools, invest in processes, and invest in skill sets. But I really do always go back to what's the business problem I'm trying to solve.
Okay, right. I'm going to go around the table with this next question. We'll start with Daniel because he's been quiet, but he had a full session to himself.
He's tired after his last one.
Exactly.
I'm completely exhausted, so that's absolutely fine.
So Daniel, what would your advice be to businesses, and there might be some in this room that are just getting started with this level of data management? What would be your one piece of advice?
Train. And it's basically train at the C level, so therefore take your whole management team and go somewhere where you see stuff that you could not even imagine that is happening. So whether it is with a company like, for example, that you are running, anything that gives you a different perspective, go to Google, go to whatever, where there are billions of different requirements are being, or questions being asked on a day-to-day basis, understand how they basically deal with data and learn that. But then as well, train and learn in the staff level. Give them the opportunity to play around with stuff. Yeah, let them do a course with regard to computer programming, what have you, so that there is an understanding in terms of, okay, I'm a buyer, but as well know what I can do with data. That will unleash, I think, a massive amount of creativity inside of the companies.
Can I actually add to that just a little vignette? And thanks for the plug. So feel free to repeat it. So years ago, no secret here, years ago, the CIA in the United States, to the point that you just said, brought McDonald's in. And it was so random, because we're all like, really? But if you think about what McDonald's, besides being a massive real estate company, they have franchised in a way, from a technology standpoint, that the CIA was trying to get out of their own mental box. And think about how different those two businesses were. But that's what they did, is they were trying to figure out how to leverage technology differently to have a desired outcome. And they mirrored how McDonald's franchises their restaurants to overlay how they actually invested in technology in the CIA for exactly the reason that you just said. It's a great example.
Okay, and now Yali, not every organisation can bring in McDonald's to give them advice.
Nor are they all CIA. But.
So, or be the CIA.
Healthy choices.
So let's say it's a smaller business getting started, as we said, with this level of data management. What would your advice be to them?
It'd probably be to put together some sort of team that could work across the different lines of business to use data to drive impact. So some kind of data team that have that outside perspective, that have seen data being used in other organizations and have that mix of skills. They can get together with the different domain owners and then really look to have that team partner with the different lines of business to actually drive value. And then socialize that around the business so that more and more people kind of learn from the bottom up.
And Nick?
So yeah, I mean, I obviously agree with everything that's been said. You know, I think a top-down approach is really important to any change, a strategic change at a business. Democratizing it, for the most part, is really important too. But then helping people understand, or building scorecards that people can understand, is it good data? Are we doing well? Really quickly. Like, there's no point having data and being data-driven if people don't understand if the data's pointing to you doing really well or not so well. Ideally, in like 5 seconds, you should be able to look at the tables and the visualization and say, oh, we're doing all right this month or this quarter or this year, or we're not doing so well. So that's probably the last part after what everyone else has said is, yeah, making it so people understand the data very, very easily.
And Jen, what advice would you give to a business that, let's say that they've already got tons of data, but they're uncertain of its validity, or they're lacking the skills internally or the resources to properly manage it? What advice would you give those companies?
Well, I think you actually just heard what you do, right? So you'd first make sure that you actually are collecting the types of data that are meaningful, and you'd iterate. I couldn't agree with you more. You get the people that are trained to do that, and then again, you'd overlay with the tools that make it fast, because if not, you'll become very overwhelmed very quickly and spend a lot of time and resources and never really get the business outcome what you're trying to do. And you don't, part of it, and I think you all would agree, I hope you would agree, is it doesn't have to be perfect day one, right? Like no one is expecting it to be perfect, but I couldn't agree with you more. It's like you have to start with a hypothesis and what you're driving towards, and then you iterate and just allow it. Because all it is information. This is okay. It's not scary, but you do have to get started.
I think that's the benefit of looking for insight, not answers as well, is insight. Yeah, it's much easier to draw an insight rather than just the actual conclusion from data. And I think you draw insight much quicker than a very solid conclusion. You're probably never going to draw a 100% conclusion that everyone's going to agree with from a huge trove of data. But I think across the board, you can quickly see, okay, is what we think correct or incorrect, no matter within a degree of certainty.
Well, and I think it's also, if you start with the end in mind, there's a very different decision trying to drive a business insight like you and I would do versus trying to fly the shuttle for NASA, right? I mean, then we want to be right, we want to be in agreement.
Yeah.
So it's very different.
The data's only ever as good as it needs to be. So if you're using data to answer a new question, there's a very high probability that it's not good enough and it needs work. And if the data's just sitting around, chances are it's not great. But the best way to drive data quality is actually using the data.
Okay, well, there was a word mentioned here, which was agreement. And there's a lot of agreement here on the panel. Does anybody have a different view or an experience from their own organisation? Great. Could we get a microphone just down to the middle here, please? And when you start your question, if you can just say who you are and where you're from, please. And if it's directed at any particular member of the panel, then please let us know. There's some smiles on faces. I hope this question's relevant.
I hope it's relevant too. Harris Sood from Deutsche Bank.
No stress.
So we've heard a few talks this morning as well around different outcomes, so business partnering, core, non-core, contribution, sustainability, relevancy. My question to each of the panel is, what do you think is more important to get to those outcomes, relationships or data?
Who wants to go first?
I think that I start first. This is a very interesting question because you have to look what kind of organization you're in. If you're in an organization that is mainly based on relationship management, you better have that under control. If you're in a data-driven organization, you look differently. It's between process and people, and some organizations are more focused on the people business, and some are much more focused on the process business. I'll give you an example. Ford was clear process. Infineon was clear process and data. Yeah? Some of the other companies that I had the pleasure to work with were much more about relationships. Do you still need data? Yeah, hell yes, you need. But first you have to deal with everyone around and build up that scenario and this understanding that you can actually work with each other. So I would say it depends really what organization you're sitting in. I don't know what Deutsche Bank kind of an organization is, whether it's more process or more people built.
I always look at relationships as context, right? I mean, I'm gonna, from my standpoint, I'm gonna care about certain pieces of data differently if you're a raw material provider versus a finished good versus you're in Russia versus China. For me, the relationships give me context from where to make business decisions about. Again, it's a very different decision, to your point, if I'm NASA and flying a space shuttle, then I care about data, yeah? But for me, relationships are very contextual.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree, and I think about who we partner with, and what they want from us is access to our trove of data. Obviously, that's the thing that we do, but they also want to know, the context of the data, and okay, so we're going to pay X for something. What would we be paying for Y? But actually, the data's not just what they want. They want an opinion, and they want our opinion to inform that data. So maybe they are paying more than they should pay, or we would expect for them to pay, but they're so confident, their data suggests that the tool is the right tool, that actually, whilst they come to us and ask for our opinion on stuff, the data is going to reign supreme. But then there's the reverse as well. So what it comes down to, I think, is, I think it always boils down to that specific interaction, and it can change what's more important, the partnership or the process can change from interaction to interaction with the same data and the same people. So you really need to understand where you're trying to get in that interaction rather than deciding hard and fast which one's more important, I would say.
Yeah, I think about data as really one of the tools we have to persuade other people of things. We like to, one of the powerful things about data is this idea of objectivity, and it can be a very sort of powerful tool for driving alignment, but ultimately the data never gives you the insight, and there's always a bit of inference from getting to the data to the insight or the answer. And so I'd agree that it sort of depends, how you use the data is going to depend on the organization. In some organizations, maybe just the relationship's enough. But even in different organizations, in different contexts, you're going to want to use the data in totally different ways. I think about organizations where there's a culture of experimentation and testing everything and showing everybody the results of the experiment versus one where you're making a decision, you just want to show that it's data informed and there's a graph that sits behind it.
Any more questions from the audience? Yes, could we get a microphone down here, please? Thank you. And again, just state your name, where you're from, please.
Yes, okay. Hello. So my name is Samira, and I am a director at Reliance Insurance Company. So my question is related to procurement, supply chain, and sustainability. And I know, some of the panelists talked about sustainability. So my question is that, I think it was Daniel or somebody mentioned that my back end could be somebody else's front end. And in the whole life cycle of a particular product, is there a way a customer at any point could or find out the carbon footprint of a particular product? Do we have enough data to calculate a carbon footprint of a particular product? Because unless we know it, it's very difficult as a customer. For example, I could be buying a product at a supermarket to see what impact it's having. And basically, my question is, do we have enough data, real data, or logical data to calculate such a parameter or a marker? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Can I start? Good question. Like it. That's what I talked about with SBTI. That's the Science-Based Target Initiative, where if your suppliers, for example, if you're in procurement and your suppliers sign up to that and they track carbon footprint, or let's say all greenhouse gases, because it's more than carbon, right? Then you are able to model basically your footprint for the supply chain. And if you put effort into that, you can as well model based on, for example, an explosion drawing, whatever, each carbon footprint for a special product that is possible. Getting that right is not easy, but I think we need to get there. Today, we're at the stage where we're far away from it right now. Most companies do not have that information available, do not have that information on a product that they're selling to anyone else. So at some point in time, you would nearly like to have something like a blockchain information where together with the product that you sell, it would as well contain the information with regard to greenhouse gas emissions going back 2, 3, 4 levels back. Yes, we should have that. And by the way, we should have that now. Yeah?
You probably can't hear me. I think Bisceglie mentioned that it usually comes up as a question or a problem, and then you kind of delve into the data to find a solution. And my problem was at a supermarket with my son saying, why are you buying this cucumber, which is not plastic wrapped? Because it's actually coming from New Zealand, and you should be instead buying a cucumber, even though it was plastic wrapped, because it's locally grown. So my question was, how do I know?
Yeah. So you're right. I mean, that's something that we need to do. Credit Suisse, for example, from next year will be able to select suppliers based on their carbon footprint. So therefore, we will have the data available, at least on our first tier, and that will be part of the selection process that we're going to take for suppliers overall. So it's not just cost, it's not just delivery, it's as well what you're doing in terms of being kind to mankind, as I mentioned before.
Isn't it? This could be an all-day fight,
Yeah.
because this is, I think that's hard. I think the point that I would agree with is that we need to agree on the model. But I think that that's a ever-changing and dynamic set of relationships in the extended supply chain, right? Because those sub-tier suppliers aren't, if they're not owned by you, then they have other customers that they're connected to as well. So that ripple effect is forever monitored.
And I give them all the opportunity then to sell their products to anyone else.
Right.
So, and if everyone would, or when most people would do that, we would have a ripple effect, which would automatically lead to a change in the industry.
Agreed. But the model.
Talking similar like with ISO 9000. When we started with ISO 9000, everyone said, I'm not going to invest in that. ISO 14001, I'm not going to invest in that. Until basically everyone said, yes, you will, because otherwise you're not going to get, or we will not buy your products. And normally, when it starts hurting your wallet, then at that point in time, it changes.
So I think this is a great example of the problem defining the data that needs to be created, data that doesn't exist today. Until people started wanting to answer the sorts of questions that you asked, we didn't have the data, but we can now go and create it, and you're creating the commercial imperatives to go and do that. There's a cost to creating that data, but there's real value, and it's when the economics are right, the data gets created. And there are graphs that show the volume of data we're creating as a human people is growing exponentially because we're asking more and more good questions and creating more data to help us answer them.
I do think it's a problem that's going to be solved I'm confident it gets solved fairly quickly because there's a lot of VC money going into green tech, which is going to lead to an explosion. Supply chain management is one of the big things that people are investing in and investing a lot of money in still, even with everything that's gone on in the last 6 months. So my assumption is, we'll start to see that become a bit more robust over the next 18, 24 months, which I think is only going to be good news for everyone.
Okay, thank you very much for your questions. We're going to draw it to a close there. Please join me in thanking our panelists who are Jennifer, Daniel, Yali, and Nick. Thank you, guys. Thank you.